A black nurse lost her job after saving the life of a little girl hit by a bullet. 24 hours later, her life was changed forever. The day was getting dark when Tiana clocked out from work. Tiana Brooks had no idea that everything in her life was about to change. She was simply heading home from work, bone-tired, mind scattered, unaware that the next few minutes would define her forever. The day had been long at the Clarendon Heights Community Clinic, filled with the usual tide of patients. A young boy with a fever that wouldn't break, an elderly woman managing her third round of chemo, a teenager too ashamed to say out loud that he was hungry. It was the same cracked sidewalk she'd walked for 5 years, past the same rundown corner store and flickering street lamps. Her backpack slung over one shoulder, she thought of leftovers waiting in her fridge and the soft jazz playlist she'd put on to wind down. She never saw it coming. The shot rang out so sharply it cracked the rhythm of the evening. It wasn't a firework. It wasn't a car backfiring. It was a bullet, and it had found a target. A scream followed, piercing, high-pitched, and full of terror. Tiana's heart lurched as she turned and saw a child collapse onto the pavement just ahead of her. People scattered like startled birds, ducking behind cars, diving into nearby shops, shouting to no one in particular. But not Tiana. Instinct took over. She ran forward, her bag dropping somewhere behind her. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. She wore a pink hoodie with a unicorn embroidered on the front, now soaked in a spreading pool of red. The child's eyes fluttered, her tiny chest rising unevenly as she gasped for air, each breath shallow and desperate. Tiana dropped to her knees. Her hands, though trembling, moved with purpose. She pressed down on the wound, murmuring soft words meant to anchor the little girl to this world. "Stay with me, sweetheart. You're going to be okay. Just look at me, okay?" Cars kept driving. Strangers stared from windows. But Tiana remained locked in a bubble of urgency, refusing to give in to the panic gnawing at her edges. Blood ran beneath her palms, warm and sticky. Minutes felt like hours. Then finally, the sound of sirens. Paramedics rushed in, forcing her back gently but firmly. "We've got it from here," one said. But she couldn't leave. She couldn't just watch the child be taken away. She stood up, swaying slightly from the exhaustion she'd been ignoring all day, and made a snap decision. Without a second thought, she followed the ambulance. She didn't know the girl's name. She didn't even know if she'd make it through the night. But she had been the last person to hold her, and that meant something. At the hospital, she waited. Nurses moved around her, unfamiliar faces in familiar uniforms. She paced the corridor outside the emergency surgery wing, her scrubs still stained with blood, her hands washed raw but still trembling. Hours passed. She refused to go home. Eventually, a doctor emerged from the operating room and gave a small nod. "She's stable." Still critical, but stable. Tiana exhaled so deeply it felt like her ribs might collapse. She leaned against the wall, her body finally reminding her it had limits. Still, she stayed. Not because she had to, but because something in her heart wouldn't let her walk away. Just as she was about to leave and rest, finally, someone approached her. A woman in a dark gray suit, holding a clipboard, her expression unreadable. "Nurse Brooks." "Yes," Tiana answered, unsure why someone from the hospital administration was speaking to her. "I'm with the hospital board. Would you mind coming with me for a moment?" Still emotionally frayed, Tiana followed the woman to a conference room down the hall. Inside sat 3 members of the hospital management board, none of whom she recognized. The air in the room was cold. They didn't waste time. "We've reviewed the situation and, while your intentions may have been commendable, we must address your conduct," one of the board members said. "You were off duty and not within the parameters of your assigned shift location. This constitutes a breach of our intervention protocol." Tiana blinked, trying to make sense of the words. "I saved a child's life," she said slowly. "Yes," another board member said, folding her hands. "But you also exposed yourself to legal liability by acting outside of clinic jurisdiction in an uncontrolled setting without authorization. It compromises our legal standing as an institution. So I'm being punished for helping her?" Tiana asked, her voice soft but steady. There was silence. Then the first board member spoke again. "We're terminating your position effective immediately. Your final paycheck will be processed by the end of the week." It was as if the floor had shifted beneath her. She stood there, frozen, trying to decide if this was a bad dream or a cruel joke. She had done what anyone with a soul should have done. She had kneeled on cold pavement and fought to keep a stranger's child alive. And this was the response? A pink slip handed down with legalese and stone-faced indifference? Thank you for your service," the woman in gray said curtly as Tiana was quietly ushered out. She walked through the hospital lobby in a daze. Outside, the night air bit at her skin, and the streetlights blurred through the sting in her eyes. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her hands were still trembling, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was something deeper. She had given everything, her skill, her energy, her heart. And in return, she had been cast aside. But what Tiana didn't know, not yet, was that the story was far from over. Something had already begun to stir, quietly, behind hospital walls and social media whispers. The little girl she saved was someone important. And within the next 24 hours, the world would know her name. Clarendon Heights never stayed silent for long. Within hours of Tiana Brooks' dismissal from the hospital, the story began to spread. Quietly at first, like a gust of wind curling under a closed door. Then, suddenly, it blew wide open. By morning, the local news stations had picked it up. The headline read, "Nurse fired after saving child shot in street incident." And that was all it took. Screens lit up across the city. The story traveled through group chats, neighborhood forums, and Twitter threads like wildfire. Some saw Tiana as a courageous guardian angel who defied bureaucracy to save an innocent life. Others weren't so generous. They called her reckless, unprofessional, unstable, a liability in scrubs. The court of public opinion was in full session, and everyone had an opinion. But while the city debated her future, Tiana sat in the still silence of her one-bedroom apartment. She hadn't left her place since returning home the night she was fired. The scrubs she had worn when she saved the little girl were still crumpled in her laundry bin, stained with dried blood and unanswered questions. She had tried to rest, but sleep was a traitor. It kept dragging her back to the moment when the child's body went limp beneath her hands. Now, she sat on the couch, legs folded beneath her, barely breathing as the local news played softly on her television. A reporter stood outside the hospital where the child, Ava, her name was Ava, was still recovering. Tiana watched as a woman came into frame. It was Ava's mother. She was holding a photo, her hand shaking, her voice caught in her throat. "She's alive today because of that nurse," the mother choked out, tears painting her cheeks. "I didn't even get her name. I want to find her. I want to thank her. Please, if you're watching, thank you." From a mother's heart. Tiana reached for the remote and turned the volume down until the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator behind her. The words echoed anyway. A thank you. From a mother. The one thing that should have brought comfort felt like a knife under her ribs. She wanted to be proud. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing. But doubt had crept in like a slow-moving fog, and it clouded everything. What if they were right? What if her actions, however well-intentioned, had compromised more than she realized? Was she reckless? Had she disobeyed rules so deeply embedded in her profession that she'd crossed an invisible line? Her hands, once so steady, now trembled in her lap. These were the same hands that had delivered newborns, that had closed the eyes of a dying veteran, that had held the shoulders of mothers who couldn't breathe through their sobs. These hands had done good in the world. They had saved lives. So why did they now feel like evidence in a trial no one had summoned her to? Her phone buzzed again. She didn't look. It had been ringing since morning. Interview requests, voicemail messages from advocacy groups, old friends who hadn't spoken to her in years now had urgent things to say. Praise filled her inbox. So did criticism. And hate. A woman she didn't even know had called her reckless savior complex and scrubs in a viral Facebook post. She tried to ignore it all. But it wasn't just the noise outside. It was the silence inside. In the clinic where she used to work, Tiana had always been grounded by one thing, her purpose. Even when the electricity flickered or the supplies ran low, even when patients couldn't pay or staff didn't show, she had purpose. Now that was gone. The badge that once hung proudly from her neck was now tossed in the bottom drawer of her kitchen, hidden under expired coupons and unopened mail. And so, for the first time in her life, Tiana wondered if compassion had betrayed her. Maybe the world no longer had room for people who acted on instinct, who chose mercy over protocol, who followed the heartbeat of humanity rather than the fine print of contracts. Maybe those days were over. She stood up slowly and crossed the room, her body moving without enthusiasm. At the window, she pulled back the curtain just slightly. Outside, people walked past, carrying bags of groceries, chatting into phones, unaware that just 2 blocks away, a nurse had lost her place in the world for doing what they might have hoped someone would do for their own child. The light was fading again, just like it had that night. The golden tint of the city was now swallowed by shades of purple and gray. It had only been a day, but it felt like a lifetime. A soft knock startled her. She froze. No one had come by since she'd been home. She wasn't expecting food. She hadn't ordered anything. The knock came again, gentle, but firm. Tiana didn't move. Not yet. Another buzz came from her phone. A message preview appeared on the screen. You don't know me, but I think the world owes you more than silence. Tiana stared at it. Her breath hitched. She didn't know who it was from, but it was the first message she didn't want to delete. The city was still talking. Whispers in boardrooms, voices on street corners, heated debates on radio shows. Her name was on coffee shop menus and PDA meetings. And while the noise thundered outside her door, her heart wrestled with a single question. Did I do the right thing? Because sometimes the deepest pain isn't losing your job or being dragged online. Sometimes it's not knowing if your courage helped or if it just made you a fool. And yet, beneath all the ache and doubt, a tiny spark refused to die. Because somewhere in a hospital bed, a little girl was breathing. Her heart still beat. Her mother still held hope. And no one could take that away from her. Not the board. Not the critics. Not even her own doubt. At exactly 7:03 p.m., Nurse Tiana Brooks was standing at her kitchen sink, rinsing the last of her dinner plate. The water was warm, almost too warm, steam curling toward the ceiling like soft smoke. The rest of the apartment was quiet. She hadn't turned on music. She hadn't turned on the TV. After a day of emotional exhaustion and endless buzzing from her phone, she wanted silence. She needed silence. The plate slipped slightly in her soapy hands, and she caught it just in time. That's when she heard it, the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate knock. 3 times. Calm. Measured. Tiana froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't ordered anything. And no one, absolutely no one, had said they were coming. Her building wasn't the kind of place that welcomed visitors without warning. Not since the shooting. Not since her name had gone viral and strangers began to form opinions about her life like they knew her. She dried her hands quickly, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline creeping up her spine. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man. Mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray tailored coat that looked far too expensive for her side of town. He didn't look like a reporter. He didn't hold a camera. He didn't look angry. He looked worn. She cracked the door just slightly. Yes. His eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. There was a weight in them, not the kind born from years, but from moments, heavy, life-changing moments. His voice was low, firm, but not unkind. Are you Nurse Tiana Brooks? She nodded slowly, uncertain. I am. He gave the faintest nod. I'm Malcolm Reed. That little girl, she's my daughter. The air in her lungs paused. Ava. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped forward, not forcefully, but with the kind of calm authority that left no room for refusal. And strangely, Tiana let him in. He walked into the small apartment and glanced around briefly, not judging, just observing, before turning to face her fully. Up close, his eyes revealed more. The sleepless nights. The restraint of a man barely holding himself together. And beneath that, a fierce light, gratitude sharpened into purpose. Tiana stood across from him, back pressed lightly against the closed door, heart still hammering. She didn't speak first. She couldn't. She's stable, Malcolm said, his voice softer now. She made it through surgery. The doctors said the only reason she's alive is because of you. Tiana swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. She's going to make it, he said. They're still monitoring her, but she's breathing on her own now. She's even asked for ice cream. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. Just a flicker. Tiana felt the sting of tears rise behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wasn't sure why this was the moment her composure cracked, but something about hearing that little detail, ice cream, made it real. Ava wasn't just a news story. She wasn't just a girl in a pink hoodie and blood-soaked unicorn. She was a child, a daughter, someone who still wanted sweetness after surviving something cruel. Malcolm walked slowly to the small dining table and pulled out a chair, lowering himself into it without asking. It wasn't arrogance. It was something else. Familiarity, maybe. Like he belonged there. You saved her, he said again. And I know you already paid a price for that. Tiana shook her head. That doesn't matter. I couldn't walk away. She was just a child. He studied her then. Quietly. Thoughtfully. As if weighing something beyond her words. As if measuring who she was, not just what she did. You didn't know who she was, he said. No, she whispered. I didn't. I'm not just Ava's father, Malcolm continued. I'm also a state legislator. District 9. Tiana's brows lifted in surprise. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected any of this. I've spent the last 15 years fighting for safer streets, better funding for hospitals, and stricter accountability for gun crimes, he said. But I've never had a bill, a meeting, a speech that saved a life the way you did yesterday. I have power, influence, but none of it mattered in that moment. He leaned forward, hands clasped. You mattered. The words hit her like a second heartbeat. For a moment, the silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that wraps around truth, that holds space for gratitude too big for language. I didn't come here just to thank you, Malcolm said at last. I came here because something needs to be made right. Tiana tilted her head. Right. You lost your job for doing what any decent human being should have done without thinking twice. That's not justice. That's bureaucracy feeding on its own rules. And it ends now. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. He placed it on the table gently, deliberately. I want to help rewrite the way this city sees people like you, he said. Not just as workers, but as warriors. Quiet warriors. Nurses who act when others freeze. Who care when others calculate. Tiana didn't touch the folder. She didn't ask what was inside. She just looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time since the shooting, her heart shifted. Not because she felt rescued, but because she felt seen. This wasn't about a job, or a paycheck, or even reputation. This was something deeper. Malcolm stood up and straightened his coat. You changed my daughter's life, Nurse Brooks, he said. Now it's my turn to change yours. And with that, he walked to the door, pausing only to look back once. I'll be in touch. Then he was gone, and Tiana remained frozen in place, the hum of the sink behind her still running, a single drop of water slipping from the faucet into the silence that followed. Her hands were still. Her heart, not quite. She didn't open the folder. Not yet. She just stood there, letting the weight of that knock, that conversation, and that moment settle deep into her bones. Something had shifted, and whatever came next, it had already begun. The next morning began like most others. Sunlight pressed against the blinds of Tiana Brooks' apartment, soft and golden, yet it felt distant. Sleep had come in small, broken doses, interrupted by thoughts she couldn't quiet. Her body ached from stress, and her mind felt like a room still echoing from the knock that had shattered the quiet just the night before. Malcolm Reed had left her speechless. A father whose child she saved. A man with power and presence who spoke not in promises, but in actions. She hadn't opened the folder he left. It still sat untouched on her kitchen table, like an unopened door. But outside, the world was already moving. By 9 a.m. Reporters stood outside Clarendon Heights General Hospital, voices raised to cameras, microphones clutched in gloved hands. The press conference had been announced without fanfare. Malcolm Reed never needed fanfare. When he spoke, the city listened. Tiana watched from her small couch, her eyes fixed on the television, unsure whether to feel terrified or grateful. Malcolm stood at the podium wearing the same gray coat, the same grave expression from the night before. But this time, something was different. This time, he was not just a father. He was a man on a mission. Good morning, he began, voice steady, echoing across screens and sidewalks. Today, I stand before you as a father who nearly lost his daughter. A father who would have buried his little girl if not for the quick, selfless actions of a woman who didn't know her name, who didn't ask questions, who didn't hesitate. A woman who acted when others stood still. Tiana's chest tightened. He continued. That woman is Nurse Tiana Brooks. She is not just a nurse. She is not just a bystander. She is not just a hero. She is proof that courage still exists in this city, that compassion still moves among us. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists jotted notes with renewed urgency. Malcolm raised a photograph of Ava's, smiling and full of life before the tragedy. Then, as if it were a formal announcement, he spoke again. Tiana's name was the first word my daughter whispered after surgery. And it's a name I want this city to remember, not for her termination, but for her triumph. Tiana's name was the first word my daughter whispered after surgery. And it's a name I want this city to remember, not for her termination, but for her triumph. He stepped back. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was respectful, sincere, the kind that came from people realizing they'd almost missed the point. The camera cut to a new angle as Malcolm returned to the mic, this time with something else in hand. a document. And so today, I am proud to announce the establishment of a new pediatric trauma center right here in Clarendon Heights, a place for families who face the worst and hope for the best, a place built not on policy, but on people. It will be called the Tiana Brooks Foundation for Emergency Hope. Tiana's breath caught. She leaned forward, staring at the screen, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her name, her story, her moment, now etched in concrete and funding and city blueprints. A foundation, a legacy, something far bigger than she had ever dreamed. Malcolm wasn't done. To lead this new facility, he said, I have personally invited Nurse Tiana Brooks to take the role of Chief Emergency Medical Director. She deserves more than a job. She deserves a mission worthy of her strength. The world fell silent in Tiana's apartment. She sat frozen, the remote slipping from her hand to the carpet below. Her pulse echoed in her ears. The man she had let into her home less than 12 hours ago had just placed her at the center of something revolutionary. This wasn't just about reinstating her name. It was about rewriting the city's values. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she answered. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman from the mayor's office. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Miss Brooks, the mayor would like to speak with you. He's on his way to the press conference and wishes to extend his personal gratitude and to confirm that your seat on the foundation board is being fast-tracked. Tiana didn't know what to say. She could barely whisper a thank you. Everything was moving so fast. That afternoon, deliveries arrived at her apartment. A bouquet of white lilies. A handwritten letter from Ava's mother. A custom-stitched nurse's jacket with her name embroidered in gold thread. But what struck her most was a small envelope taped to her door. Inside was a child's drawing. A stick-figure nurse with long, curly hair and brown skin stood beside a smiling little girl in a hospital bed. Above them, written in big, uneven letters, "Thank you, Miss Tiana. I love you." She held it to her chest and finally allowed the tears to come. The woman who had been fired less than 48 hours ago was now being held up as a pillar of the city's future. No longer dismissed, no longer questioned, she was being honored not in pity, but in purpose. She thought of the board members who couldn't look her in the eye, the ones who hid behind policies while a child's life hung in the balance. She thought of their cold words, breach of protocol, unauthorized intervention, and realized something now: they had been protecting rules. She had been protecting life, and that distinction was everything. Later that evening, she opened the folder Malcolm had left on her table. Inside was a letter, handwritten, careful, no grand legal statements. Just a father, expressing gratitude in full. And a contract, not just for employment, but for ownership, for leadership, for a voice that would shape how care was delivered to every child in Clarendon Heights. Tiana didn't rush to sign it. She sat with it, let it breathe, because for the first time in days, her heart was no longer beating in fear or anger, but in quiet hope. She walked to the mirror and looked at herself. She wasn't wearing scrubs. Her hair was tied up loosely. Her eyes were tired. But in that reflection stood a woman no longer defined by the moment she lost everything. Now she was defined by the moment the world gave her something greater. From fired to funded. From silenced to celebrated. Tiana Brooks, nurse, survivor, healer, was now the foundation for something far bigger than herself. And the city was finally ready to follow her lead. What began as a ripple in Clarendon Heights became a wave that swept across the city. At first, it was a few murmurs, quiet disapproval shared over morning coffee or whispered in hospital corridors. But then the signs appeared, handwritten, bold, and trembling with conviction. Let heroes heal. Justice for Nurse Brooks. Policy doesn't bleed, people do. Dozens became hundreds. Protesters lined the streets outside the clinic where Tiana Brooks had once poured her heart into every patient. Nurses in scrubs locked arms with single mothers, veterans, and high school students, all demanding the same thing: recognition. Not just for Tiana, but for every quiet hero the system tried to silence. News outlets couldn't ignore the movement. Stories emerged, not from headlines, but from the mouths of those who had once sat on the other side of Tiana's care. A teenage boy recounted how she'd once brought him a warm coat during a snowstorm. An elderly woman revealed Tiana had secretly paid for her insulin when Medicare delayed approval. One father said she stayed with his son all night after surgery, never asking for thanks. Then came the story that broke hearts wide open. Tiana had, on more than one occasion, slept in her car behind the clinic. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she didn't want to be late for early shifts after working into the night. She had given up warmth and rest so others wouldn't lose precious time. And yet, she'd been cast aside. Those who had once scrolled past her story now paused. They watched, they listened, and for many, it stirred something deep. She wasn't just a nurse. She was their neighbor, their healer, a woman whose sacrifice had been too easy to forget until it was lit up in headlines. Letters came from across the country. Handwritten, typed, painted on murals. A group of schoolchildren from Vermont sent in cards covered in crayon hearts. A retired nurse in Oregon mailed Tiana her first stethoscope as a symbol of sisterhood. Governors, advocates, and influencers all spoke her name. Faced with the fire of public outrage, the clinic tried to reverse its decision, quietly, discreetly, without ceremony. A formal apology was drafted, statements prepared. But it was far too late. Tiana didn't look back. She had stepped into something bigger now, something unshackled by fear or red tape. She had become a symbol of resilience, of moral clarity, of what happens when one woman chooses compassion over compliance. The city that once turned its back on her now stood proudly in her shadow. Because Tiana's pain had not destroyed her. It had ignited her. And from that fire, a community awakened. The sky above Clarendon Heights was a soft, forgiving blue. The kind of sky that made you believe healing was possible. It was opening day at the brand new Tiana Brooks Foundation for Emergency Hope, and the city had never seen anything like it. Glass doors swung open in unison, and in walked two figures, one tall and graceful, the other small, smiling, and full of life. Ava Reed, barely 7 and still recovering from trauma, clutched Tiana's hand as they stepped through the double doors of the trauma center that now bore the nurse's name. Her once pale face had color again, her step still a little unsteady, but her eyes sparkled with a kind of joy that only the very young could carry through something so dark. Tiana looked down at her, gently squeezing her hand. No words were needed. Ava squeezed back. The center's entrance hall opened like a cathedral of hope. Sunlight poured through tall windows and danced across murals painted by local artists. Scenes of healing hands, blooming gardens, open skies, and children holding balloons as they climbed out of hospital beds. Every wall told a story, but none louder than the one in the far right corner. There, in a large black frame, hung a photograph, slightly blurred, raw, and filled with truth. It captured Tiana on that fateful day, kneeling on a cracked city sidewalk, pressing her blood-soaked hands against a small chest. Her head was bowed, lips moving in silent words, her whole body wrapped around the fragile form of a child who hadn't yet been named to her. The photo had been taken by a bystander, someone who admitted, days later, that he had hidden behind a parked car, too afraid to help, too frozen to act. He had raised his phone instead, and somehow, in doing nothing, had immortalized the power of someone who did everything. It was hard for Tiana to look at it, even now, but Ava tugged her sleeve. "That's you," she said with pride. "That's when you caught me." Tiana's lips trembled. "Yes, baby. That's when I caught you." They walked deeper into the building, past rows of new beds, pediatric wings named after survivors, and a glass-walled emergency bay built with speed and purpose in mind. Nurses moved through the halls with calm efficiency, many of them volunteers from Tiana's old clinic, who had left to follow her. In the courtyard, a large crowd was gathered beneath a white awning. Rows of chairs were filled with guests, doctors, parents, city officials, children, veterans, and many who had never met Tiana in person but had been moved by her story. Camera crews stood off to the side, but they weren't the focus. All eyes turned as Tiana and Ava stepped into view. A hush fell over the crowd, not the forced silence of ceremony, but the reverent quiet that follows real emotion. Tiana helped Ava into the front row where Malcolm Reed sat waiting, his eyes already glistening. Then, slowly, Tiana stepped forward. It was the first time she would speak publicly. Since the shooting, since the firing, since the chaos, she had declined every interview, refused every spotlight. Until now, a small platform stood at the center of the courtyard, its podium plain and wooden, adorned only with a single white rose. Tiana stepped onto it. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers, but every one of them had been touched by what happened that day. Every one of them had come not just to witness something new, but to honor something sacred. She adjusted the microphone, then paused. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, not theatrical, not rehearsed, just real. "I've never been comfortable with the word hero," she began. "I'm a nurse. I listen. I care. I act when someone needs help. That's not heroism. That's humanity. A breeze moved through the trees above, rustling leaves like pages being turned. I didn't save Ava because I was trained to, she continued. I saved her because my heart wouldn't let me do anything else. When I saw her lying on that pavement, I didn't see statistics or policy or risk. I saw a child, and I knew, without even thinking, that I had to fight for her. She took a breath, her hands gently gripping the sides of the podium. I lost a job because of that choice. I lost my peace. For a while, I even lost faith in whether compassion still had a place in this world. There was a stillness in the crowd now, not even birds chirping, just the soft sound of one woman telling the truth. But something happened after I fell, she said. You, this city, you helped me rise. You reminded me that mercy matters, that instinct matters, that doing the right thing doesn't always come with applause, but it's still worth doing. Her eyes flicked to Ava, who sat cradled in her father's lap, waving shyly at her. And that little girl right there. She's the reason I'm standing here today, Tiana said, her voice faltering only slightly. She's not just a survivor. She's a spark. And from that spark came this place. A place built not for rules, but for people, for children, for hope. She stepped back slightly, as if ready to close, but something inside her shifted, like the final page of a chapter long delayed. And if there's one thing I've learned, she said, voice now clear and full, it's this. Compassion may cost you everything. But in the end, it gives more than it takes. The words settled over the crowd like a blanket. People didn't cheer. Not right away. Many stood quietly, wiping eyes, taking it in. It wasn't just a speech. It was a benediction, a farewell to fear, a declaration that kindness, even when punished, would always rise again. Then the clapping began. Slow, gentle. Then it grew until the courtyard shook with applause. Ava ran up to the stage, hugging Tiana's leg with both arms. Tiana lifted her into her arms, resting her forehead gently against the girl's. And in that moment, the future didn't seem uncertain. It seemed beautiful, because the nurse who once lost everything for doing what was right had just shown the world what doing right could truly build. If you enjoyed this powerful story of Nurse Tiana Brooks, Little Ava, and Malcolm Reed, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Tell us what you feel about how the story ended. Was justice truly served? Drop your thoughts in the comments, rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters. Be part of the conversation and keep the message alive.